Sometimes, strength isn't in how hard you fight, it's in how deeply you refuse to yield. In the quiet southern town of Maplewood, 70-year-old Elias Johnson spends his days reflecting on a past filled with courage, sacrifice, and immeasurable loss. Once a fierce civil rights activist, Elias now seeks only peace. But when a group of white supremacists targets him as their latest victim, they underestimate the unyielding resolve of a man who has already fought through storms of hatred. Unbeknownst to them, Elias's estranged son, Jackson Johnson, is a seasoned commander in the National Guard. Hardened by years of military service and a deep wound from his mother's unsolved death, Jackson returns home just in time to defend his father and ignite a series of events that will unravel long-buried secrets and force father and son to confront the deep divides between them. As they face their enemies together, a devastating truth emerges. The gang's leader, Brad Tate, belongs to the same lineage responsible for the hate crime that tore their family apart. Now, Jackson must choose between the vengeance that simmers in his soul and the justice his father has fought for all his life. With the future of their family and their town hanging in the balance, Elias and Jackson embark on a journey of redemption, love, and the enduring fight to break the chains of hatred. In the weight of blood, the battle is not only for survival but for the hope of a better tomorrow. Will they rise above the past or be consumed by it? Elias Johnson sat on the weathered bench under an ancient oak, its long limbs draped in Spanish moss swaying in the light breeze. The rippling surface of the small pond before him reflected the soft afternoon light. Around him, the hum of Maplewood Park was distant, children's laughter on the playground, the occasional chirp of birds, and the muted shuffle of footsteps on the worn paths. "Elias, you still keeping that bench warm?" Clara Thompson called, approaching with a warm smile. She clutched a bag from her cafe, the aroma of fried chicken and biscuits trailing behind her. Elias chuckled. "Somebody's got to keep it from blowing away," he said, motioning for her to sit. Clara eased down beside him and handed him a wrapped sandwich. "You shouldn't skip lunch. Thin as a rail already." "Not skipping, Clara. Just postponing," he said with a grin, unwrapping the food. After a pause, he added, "You been hearing things around town?" She hesitated, adjusting the colorful scarf around her neck. "More whispers than usual. You know the kind. Folks saying Brad Tate and his crew have been making trouble out near the old mill." Elias's jaw tightened, but he kept his gaze steady on the pond. "Been hearing trouble since I was Jackson's age," he murmured. "Ain't nothing new." "You've got a target on you," Clara said, her voice firm. "Just 'cause the world's spinning faster doesn't mean folks like Brad have stopped clinging to hate." "Clara," Elias said softly, "they want fear, and they're not getting it from me. Fear is their leash." Their conversation drifted to other topics, but Clara's concern lingered in the air, unspoken and unresolved. The hideout reeked of stale beer and neglect. Broken furniture and tattered posters lined the walls of the old barn, where Brad Tate leaned against a crude wooden table. "Listen up, boys," Brad growled, pacing in front of his small but eager audience. "That old man in the park, Elias Johnson. He sits there like he owns this town, like it ain't changing. Well, I'm done waiting." One of the younger members hesitated. "You sure about this, Brad? Ain't he just some retired guy?" Brad's face twisted into a sneer. "You think history stays buried? My granddaddy fought to keep this place right, and Elias spit on his legacy. We're sending a message, loud and clear." The barn echoed with murmurs, and Brad slammed his fist on the table. "You with me or not?" They nodded reluctantly, adrenaline overtaking their unease. That evening, Elias found Clara standing on his porch. She crossed her arms, glaring at the chipped paint on the doorframe as though it were the cause of her worry. "Evening," he greeted, stepping outside. "Elias, you might be fine not fearing them, but that doesn't mean they don't see you," Clara snapped, hands on her hips. "Brad's been stirring up trouble, and I'd bet money you're his next target." Elias sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "Let them stir. Fear won't stop them, and hiding sure won't either." "You stubborn fool," Clara muttered, shaking her head. You can't fix hate overnight, no matter how much you believe in peace. It's not about fixing hate, Elias replied. It's about living in spite of it. Clara softened but stayed resolute. You may not be afraid for yourself, but think about Jackson. Don't give him a reason to bury another parent. The mention of his son made Elias falter, his face briefly shadowed with regret. I hear you, he said finally. But I've faced worse than Brad Tate. The sun had dipped low, casting an orange glow over the park. Elias rose from his bench, gathering his hat and book, when he noticed a group of figures in the distance. Brad Tate approached, flanked by 3 of his men. Evening, Mr. Johnson, Brad called, his voice laced with mockery. Elias kept walking, his cane steady against the path. Got no business with you, young man, he said evenly. See, that's the thing, Brad snarled, stepping closer. You think you're above it all. Like you ain't part of this town's history. Elias stopped and turned to face them, his voice steady. History isn't yours to twist and claim, Brad. And I won't be your pawn in whatever fight you're looking for. Brad's lip curled in frustration, but he hesitated, noticing a family nearby. He leaned closer to Elias, lowering his voice. You can't sit on that bench forever. Without another word, Elias walked past him, his steps unhurried. Miles away, Jackson Johnson adjusted his uniform in his quarters when the phone rang. He answered gruffly. Jackson, it's Clara, her voice rushed. What's wrong? It's your dad, she said. Brad Tate's gang harassed him at the park today. I'm afraid this is just the start. Jackson closed his eyes, exhaling sharply. He say anything? He brushes it off like it's nothing, but I know better, Clara replied. And you do too. Jackson hesitated, memories of his father's stoicism resurfacing, along with the pain of their last conversation. I'll book a train, he said finally. Make it fast, Clara urged. As Jackson hung up, he stared out the window. He'd left Pinewood to escape its ghosts. Now, those ghosts seemed intent on dragging him back. Jackson Johnson stepped off the train, duffel bag slung over one shoulder, his military boots clunking against the platform. The sight of Maplewood, with its worn-down charm and familiar stillness, was both comforting and suffocating. The air smelled of warm pine and lingering nostalgia. He scanned the platform, spotting Clara leaning against a rusted rail. She waved with her usual composure, her colorful scarf catching in the breeze. Welcome home, soldier, Clara greeted, pulling him into a brief hug. Her sharp, intelligent eyes steadied him. You're as tense as I'd expect. Jackson smirked faintly. Could have fooled me with the welcome wagon. They walked together toward her car parked near the station. Clara broke the silence. It's been a long time since you've been back. That was by design, Jackson replied flatly. Clara sighed. I know what kept you away, Jackson, but some things don't heal until you face them. He glanced at her. Let's get this over with. Elias was on the porch when Jackson and Clara pulled up. The old man stood with his arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable as his son stepped out of the car. Didn't think I'd see you here, Elias said, his voice calm but distant. You left me no choice, Jackson replied as he approached the steps. Clara says you've got trouble brewing. Figured someone should handle it since you won't. Elias raised an eyebrow. Is that so? Clara cleared her throat. I'll leave you two to talk. You've got catching up to do. She waved and drove off before either man could protest. An awkward silence fell as Jackson dropped his bag on the porch. Elias finally spoke. You think you're just gonna come here and fix things? Like the past doesn't matter? I came because someone has to, Jackson shot back. If you just let people help you for once. Let them help. Elias's voice rose, a rare flash of frustration breaking through. You've got no idea what you're talking about. The minute you rely on folks around here, they'll let you down. Jackson shook his head. That's why you're alone. That's why you shut everyone out after Mom. He stopped himself, his jaw tightening. Elias's expression hardened. We're not digging up graves today. Then don't ask me to pretend they aren't there, Jackson said, pushing past him and into the house. The barn creaked under the weight of tension as Brad paced. He slapped a crowbar into his palm, his jaw tight with restless energy. That old man in the park doesn't get to make us look weak, Brad growled. He thinks his name carries weight? He thinks he can sit there like nothing's changed? It ain't just him anymore, one of his crew said cautiously. The soldier's back. Jackson Johnson. I saw him at the train station. Brad froze, his face twisting with anger. So he's crawling back to protect Daddy? That makes him fair game too. Brad, another member hesitated, you sure about going this far? Brad swung the crowbar, hitting a beam with a deafening crack. This ain't about being sure, he snapped. This is about showing them what happens when they step out of line. The following morning, Clara convinced Elias to meet Jackson at the park, hoping the change in scenery would soften the tension. They strolled the well-trodden paths in silence until Elias spoke. You were born around here, he said. You've seen what this place can do to people who don't stand up to it. Standing up didn't bring her back, Jackson replied coldly. It didn't stop anything. Elias stopped and faced his son. No, it didn't. But it made them see us. Made them remember we're not invisible. Jackson stared at the ground. You made me invisible, Dad. When she died, you shut down, and I was left to deal with it alone. Before Elias could respond, they spotted Brad and his gang near the gazebo. Brad smirked as their eyes met. You lost? Jackson called out, his voice sharp. Brad sauntered closer but stopped just short of the pair. Just out for a walk. Didn't know the park was off limits. It's not, Elias said calmly. But if you're here for trouble, I suggest you keep walking. Brad glared but turned away, his group following reluctantly. Jackson clenched his fists. That's all it takes for them to go? You're fine with that? Violence isn't how you win, Elias said. You save that for when you've got no other choice. Late that night, the sound of glass shattering ripped through the silence of Elias's street. Jackson jolted awake, grabbing the bat he'd left by the couch. Stay inside, he ordered Elias, who was already reaching for his phone to call the authorities. Jackson rushed outside to see Brad's gang retreating, laughter echoing as they disappeared into the shadows. The front porch was littered with broken glass and spray-painted symbols. The sight of the hateful graffiti sent a surge of rage through Jackson. Elias stepped outside, surveying the damage with a deep frown. They want a reaction, he said quietly. Well, they're about to get one, Jackson snapped, fists clenched. You still think you can reason with them? I think escalating this won't end well for anybody, Elias replied, his tone measured. We fight smarter, not harder. Jackson stormed back inside. I'll deal with this my way, he muttered under his breath, already planning his next move. The morning after Brad's gang struck, Jackson stood in the yard, surveying the damage. The hateful symbols painted on the porch stung more than he cared to admit. He knelt, scrubbing at the marks with a brush and bucket of soapy water, his movements hard and purposeful. Elias appeared behind him, his steps deliberate. Leave it. No amount of scrubbing will change what they did, he said, his voice heavy. Jackson's hands tightened around the brush. If you're suggesting I ignore this, you've got the wrong guy. Ignoring isn't the same as rising above, Elias said. That's a lesson your mother taught me every day. Jackson's movements faltered, but he didn't look up. Her lessons didn't stop them then, did they? Elias sighed and leaned against the railing. This fight isn't new, son. Hate doesn't disappear overnight. But adding more fire doesn't extinguish the flames. Jackson finally looked up, his eyes fierce. You can believe that if you want. But sitting quiet has done nothing for you, has it? Look where it's gotten you, Dad. Graffiti on your front porch, people like Brad laughing about it in the shadows. The words hung in the air as Elias turned away, retreating into the house. Determined to act, Jackson drove into town and parked in front of the library. Clara had told him that the old archives held more about Maplewood's history than most people cared to remember. Inside, the scent of old paper and dust filled the air. Mrs. Alcott, the librarian, glanced up and offered a thin smile. "Afternoon, Jackson. Been a long time since I've seen you in here." "Afternoon," he said with a nod. "I need to look at the old papers." Mid to late 60s, anything involving, he hesitated. Hate crimes or extremist groups. Her smile faltered, replaced by an understanding nod. Back corner. Files labeled incidents, just past the history section. Jackson dug through the brittle folders, unearthing articles with faded headlines. One, dated 1968, caught his eye. Community leader targeted in cross-burning incident. He traced the words with his finger, his stomach tightening. The leader in question had been his father, Elias Johnson, and it wasn't the only mention. Another article detailed arrests of members linked to a local hate group, including a familiar last name, Tate. As the pieces fell into place, Jackson's hand trembled. The group his father fought against all those years ago was connected to Brad's family. Back at the house, Jackson tossed the folder of articles onto the kitchen table. Elias, sitting with a cup of tea, looked up slowly. "What's this?" Elias asked. "What you didn't tell me," Jackson said, his voice clipped. "Brad's family. They were part of that group, the one you fought against. They targeted you for years." Elias took a deep breath, setting his cup down. "I didn't want to dredge up the past. But it matters," Jackson said, leaning forward. "It's not just about the past. It's about now. How am I supposed to make a plan if I don't know what we're up against?" Elias's eyes softened, but his tone remained steady. "Knowing their names doesn't change their motives. Hate doesn't need a reason to come knocking. You're fighting a symptom, not the disease. And doing nothing is the cure?" Jackson shot back. "Sometimes you fight without ever throwing a punch," Elias said quietly. "That was how we survived then. And it's how I survive now." Meanwhile, Brad gathered his gang back at the barn. Tension crackled in the air as his anger boiled over. "You see what they're doing?" Brad shouted, slamming a hand down on the table. Jackson sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. Running to the library like some detective. One of his followers spoke up cautiously. "Maybe we call it off, Brad. We've already scared the old man. Isn't that enough?" Brad's glare could have cut steel. "Enough? You think this ends with scaring him? This doesn't end until they know who's in charge of this town. And you're either with me or in the way." The room fell silent. No one dared argue further. Brad turned to his lieutenant. "Tonight. We finish this." The first sign of trouble came as night settled over Elias's street. A distant rumble, followed by shouts, alerted Jackson to the danger. He grabbed his rifle, his military instincts kicking in. "Stay inside," Jackson ordered Elias, who nodded and bolted the door. From the window, Jackson saw them coming, Brad's gang with makeshift weapons and torches. They stopped in front of the house, their leader calling out. "Come on out, Jackson. Or are you too scared to face us?" Brad taunted. Jackson stepped onto the porch, weapon in hand, but pointed downward. "You've made your point, Brad. Walk away before this gets worse." Brad sneered. "Look at you, playing the hero. Just like your old man. Maybe you'll learn the hard way. You're outnumbered, out of your element, and out of time." Jackson took a deliberate step forward, meeting Brad's eyes. "You think this is a fair fight? You don't know what I'm capable of." The gang hesitated, uneasy at Jackson's steady demeanor. When Brad lunged forward, chaos erupted. Jackson quickly incapacitated 2 gang members with precise strikes before retreating toward the house to protect Elias. Inside, Elias grabbed Jackson by the arm. "They'll come back with more if you make this worse." They'll come back anyway, Jackson snapped, his chest heaving. But I'll be ready. Outside, the gang retreated, their confidence shaken. But their parting threats left no doubt this wasn't over. Jackson awoke the next morning to find Elias seated at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. The quiet stillness in the air carried a weight heavier than usual. "You don't sleep much, do you?" Jackson remarked, pouring himself coffee. Elias gave a faint smile. "Years of practice. Too many nights waiting for the phone to ring with bad news." Jackson hesitated before sitting across from his father. The events of the previous night gnawed at him. "Why didn't you tell me about Brad's family?" he asked, his tone even but loaded with expectation. Elias took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the swirling tea. "Because it wouldn't have changed anything. Don't you think I deserve the truth?" Jackson pressed. Elias's voice dropped low. "Your mother, she didn't just die in some random act of hate. She was targeted. It was deliberate. And it wasn't just some unknown faces in a crowd. It was their family, the Tates." Jackson's chest tightened. "You knew?" "Yes," Elias said quietly. "And I knew if you found out when you were younger, you'd try to get vengeance. You weren't ready for that kind of anger, son. I kept it from you because I needed you to survive, not lose yourself in hate." Jackson stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "You had no right to decide what I could handle. She was my mother too." Elias's calm never wavered. "And you were my boy. I'd do it again if it meant keeping you safe." The silence stretched as Jackson wrestled with the weight of the revelation. Later that morning, Jackson drove into town and parked outside Clara's cafe. He found her wiping down a table near the window. "Morning, stranger," Clara greeted. "You look like you've been up against the wall all night." "Something like that," Jackson muttered, sitting at the counter. She placed a cup of coffee in front of him without asking. "Your dad's got his ways," she said softly. "Sometimes frustrating ways, but always for a reason." Jackson stared into the dark liquid. "He kept it from me. The truth about Mom, about Brad's family. I can't decide if I'm more angry or more lost." Clara leaned against the counter. "He was protecting you the only way he knew how. Doesn't mean it wasn't painful for him too." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Feels like he made me part of the same silence that let it happen." "Silence doesn't heal, Jackson. Action does," Clara said. "But you've got to make sure your actions come from the right place. Hate doesn't end hate." He nodded slowly. Clara's words settled like stones in his chest, heavy, but grounding. That afternoon, Jackson found Elias outside, tending to the modest garden Clara had insisted he keep. The older man's movements were careful, each action deliberate. "I owe you an apology," Elias said, not looking up. "I should have told you sooner." Jackson crossed his arms. "Why didn't you?" "Because I've lived a long life, and I've learned something. Vengeance doesn't rebuild anything," Elias said, finally meeting his son's gaze. "It takes more from you than it gives." "They took her from us," Jackson said, his voice shaking. "They can't just get away with it." "Getting justice isn't the same as revenge," Elias replied. "And you've got a choice. You've got discipline, training. Use that to fight smarter. Fight for something, not just against someone." Jackson's fists clenched and released. "Easier said than done." "I'm not asking you to do it because it's easy," Elias said softly. "I'm asking you because it's necessary." In the fading light of the day, Brad's gang met in the barn, their voices low but filled with tension. "Johnson's son is digging where he doesn't belong," Brad said, pacing furiously. "He's dragging up old history like it's gonna change anything. Well, we'll show him history isn't some dusty book. It's alive and ready to strike back." A few of the gang members exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, a wiry younger man, spoke up. "Brad, are we sure this is the right move? Things are getting bigger than we planned." Brad slammed his fist against the table, making everyone flinch. This is my town. My family built it, and we'll decide who stays in it. If you're too scared to follow through, there's the door. No one moved. Brad leaned closer, his voice low and menacing. Tonight, we make it clear, the Johnsons don't get to win. As night fell, Jackson found himself sitting on the porch, staring out at the quiet street. The folder of old articles and pictures sat beside him, a harsh reminder of what he'd uncovered. Elias joined him, lowering himself into the chair with a soft groan. Thinking about what comes next? Jackson nodded. I don't know what it looks like, justice, I mean. Part of me wants to burn it all down. Elias nodded slowly. I know. I've been there. But you can't carry that fire without burning yourself too. Jackson glanced at his father. You sound like you already know what I'm going to do. I know you'll do the right thing, Elias said simply. But what's right ain't always what's easy. As the distant rumble of an engine broke the quiet, Jackson stood, squaring his shoulders. Then I guess I better get to work. Elias sat at the kitchen table, his hands folded before him, his eyes fixed on the frayed edges of an old photograph lying on the worn wood. Jackson stood nearby, his imposing figure a contrast to the room's modest surroundings. He unfolded a map of the house and surrounding areas, spreading it across the table. We're going to secure the house. Every window, every door. I'll set up barriers and traps in case they try to force their way in, Jackson said, his voice steady, each word precise. Elias glanced at him, his expression unreadable. You really think they'll come back? Jackson's gaze didn't waver. They will. Brad doesn't strike me as the type to leave a job unfinished. You can't let anger cloud your judgment, Elias said quietly, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. This isn't anger, Dad. It's preparation. And I need you to trust me on this. Elias sighed, leaning back in his chair. I've lived a long time, Jackson. Fought battles you can't even imagine. And one thing I've learned is that anger, no matter how justified, leads to destruction. Not justice. Jackson leaned forward, his hands on the table. This isn't about anger. It's about making sure you're safe. Let me handle this. For a moment, their eyes locked, years of estrangement and unspoken words filling the space between them. Finally, Elias nodded. Do what you need to do. But remember, this house is more than just walls. It's my life. Don't let them destroy that. At Clara's cafe, the clinking of coffee cups and low murmurs of conversation created a familiar backdrop. Clara stood behind the counter, her sharp eyes scanning the room as Jackson sat at a corner table, a notebook open before him. I've been hearing things, Clara said as she set a fresh cup of coffee in front of him. People talking about Brad's family. You're not the only one who wants them gone. Jackson looked up. Who's willing to talk? Clara leaned in, lowering her voice. A few folks remember the old days. The things Brad's grandfather did. You need to speak to Sheriff McAllister. He's retired, but he's got files. Evidence they buried years ago. Can you set up a meeting? Clara nodded. Already done. He'll see you tonight. Jackson smiled faintly. You're always one step ahead. Clara smirked. Someone has to be. Just remember, Jackson, this isn't just about Brad. It's about breaking the cycle. He nodded, her words settling heavily on him as he prepared for the next step. Brad paced the dimly lit barn, his footsteps echoing against the wooden planks. His gang sat around, their faces shadowed by the flickering light of a single lantern. Jackson's digging into our family, Brad spat, slamming his fist against the table. He thinks he can bring us down. Maybe we're pushing too hard, one of his men ventured cautiously. People in town are talking. It might be better to lay low. Brad's eyes snapped to the man, his face twisting in anger. Lay low? After what they've done to us? My grandfather built this town, and now they want to erase us. No. We finish this. We show them who's in charge. The room fell silent, the weight of Brad's words pressing down on everyone. One by one, they nodded, their loyalty more rooted in fear than conviction. The night air was cool, the sounds of crickets filling the quiet. Jackson and Elias stood on the porch, the faint glow of the moon casting shadows across their faces. "I've been thinking," Elias began, his voice soft. "About what you said. About justice." Jackson turned to him, waiting. "You have to promise me something," Elias continued. "When the time comes, you'll do what's right. Not what feels right. There's a difference." Jackson hesitated, his jaw tightening. What if what's right isn't enough? Elias placed a hand on his shoulder. "It has to be. Hate is a poison, son. Don't let it consume you." Jackson nodded reluctantly. "I'll try. That's all I ask." Main Street was quiet as Clara approached the hardware store where Brad's younger brother, Nate, worked. She found him stacking boxes near the back, his movements nervous and hurried. "Nate," she called softly. He looked up, startled. "Clara. What are you doing here?" "I came to talk some sense into you," she said, stepping closer. "You don't have to follow Brad down this road. It doesn't end well." Nate glanced around, lowering his voice. "You don't understand. If I cross him, I'm done for. He'll turn on me. And if you keep going, what happens when someone gets hurt? Or worse? You think you can live with that?" Nate's hands trembled slightly as he set down the box. "It's not that simple." "It never is," Clara said, her tone firm but kind. "But you have a choice. Don't let fear decide for you." Nate didn't respond, his eyes cast downward as Clara turned and walked away, her words lingering in the air. Behind her, Nate's expression hardened, the conflict within him unresolved as he returned to his work. The night descended heavily over Elias's home. Jackson stood by the living room window, the faint glow of a street lamp casting a soft light across his face. He had been keeping watch for hours, his instincts honed from years of military service. Elias sat in his armchair, the tension palpable. "You should rest, Jackson. You'll need your strength." "Can't risk it," Jackson replied, his eyes scanning the shadows beyond the window. "They'll come when they think we're vulnerable." As if on cue, the sound of breaking glass shattered the silence. Elias flinched, and Jackson was immediately in motion. He grabbed a flashlight and his makeshift weapon, a sturdy iron rod he had found in the garage. "Stay here," Jackson commanded, his tone brooking no argument. Elias nodded reluctantly, gripping the armrests of his chair as Jackson slipped out the back door into the night. The front yard was illuminated by the flickering flames of a small fire. A Molotov cocktail had been thrown through the window of Elias's shed. Jackson crouched low, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. From the shadows, he heard voices. "They're inside," one voice said, low and urgent. "We'll smoke him out," another replied. Jackson crept forward, his movements silent and deliberate. He spotted two figures near the fence, their silhouettes outlined by the flames. "Hey!" Jackson shouted, his voice cutting through the night. The figures froze, startled, before one of them turned and bolted. The other hesitated, drawing a knife. Jackson advanced quickly, his military training evident in his calculated movements. A swift strike disarmed the man, and with a well-placed blow, Jackson knocked him to the ground. "Tell Brad he's made a mistake," Jackson growled before the man scrambled away into the darkness. "They're testing us," Jackson said as he re-entered the house, his breath measured but tense. "That wasn't the main attack." Elias nodded, his expression grave. "Then we need to be ready. They won't stop until they get what they came for." The two of them worked quickly, extinguishing the small fire and fortifying the house. Jackson moved with precision, setting traps and reinforcing doors. Elias followed his lead, his age no deterrent to the determination in his movements. A sudden knock at the back door startled them both. Jackson raised his hand, signaling Elias to stay quiet. He approached cautiously, peering through the peephole. "It's Clara," he said, opening the door just enough to let her in. "They're rallying more people," Clara said breathlessly. "I saw them heading toward the woods with more weapons." Jackson's jaw tightened. "We need to move. They'll surround the house next." "Clara, can you drive Elias to safety?" "Not a chance," Elias interjected. "This is my home. I'm not running." "Dad," Jackson started, but Elias cut him off. "No. We've fought too long and too hard to give in now." Clara placed a hand on Jackson's arm. "We'll stand together. If they want to fight, they'll get one." Under the cover of darkness, Jackson led Clara and Elias through the woods behind the house. The air was thick with tension, the rustling of leaves and distant voices their only soundtrack. "Stay close," Jackson whispered, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. Ahead, the sound of footsteps and murmured voices grew louder. Jackson signaled for Clara and Elias to stop as he moved ahead. Through the trees, he spotted Brad and several of his gang members huddled around a map, their weapons gleaming in the faint moonlight. "We take them tonight," Brad said, his voice filled with venom. "No more waiting." Jackson crept closer, his muscles tensed, ready to strike. But a sudden snap of a branch underfoot gave him away. Brad's head snapped up, his eyes locking onto the shadowy figure of Jackson. "You," Brad sneered, drawing his pistol. "Finally decided to face me like a man?" Jackson stepped forward, his hands raised slightly. "You don't have to do this, Brad. Walk away now, and nobody gets hurt." Brad laughed, the sound sharp and bitter. "Hurt? Oh, I'm just getting started." Before Brad could act, Jackson moved. He lunged forward, disarming Brad with a swift motion and sending the pistol flying into the underbrush. Chaos erupted as the gang scrambled, some fleeing while others charged at Jackson. Clara and Elias, hearing the commotion, rushed forward. Clara wielded a heavy flashlight, swinging it with surprising force at one of the attackers. Elias used a sturdy branch, his movements slower but no less determined. The fight was brief but intense, ending with Brad and two of his men retreating into the woods. Jackson, breathing heavily, turned to Clara and Elias. "We're not safe yet," he said. "We need reinforcements." As dawn approached, the distant hum of engines grew louder. Jackson's call for help had been answered. Two National Guard vehicles rolled into the clearing by Elias's house, their presence a reassuring sight. "Looks like you've been busy," one of the soldiers said as he stepped out, nodding at Jackson. "Thanks for coming," Jackson replied. "They'll be back, and they'll be desperate." Elias watched as the soldiers set up a perimeter around the property, their efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of the previous night. Clara approached him, her expression a mix of relief and resolve. "They'll think twice before coming back now," she said. Elias nodded but remained silent, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the yard, but the tension lingered. Jackson sat on the porch steps, cleaning his weapon, his expression unreadable. Elias joined him, lowering himself onto the step with a quiet sigh. "You did good last night," Elias said after a moment. "It's not over," Jackson replied. Elias nodded. "No, it's not. But you've given us a chance. That's more than I could have hoped for." Jackson looked at his father, his gaze softening. "We'll finish this. Together." Elias smiled faintly. "That's all I ever wanted." The town square buzzed with uneasy energy. Jackson stood on the courthouse steps, holding a folder thick with evidence. A small crowd had gathered, murmurs spreading through the air like wildfire. Clara stood nearby, her presence a steadying force. Elias watched from a bench under a sprawling oak tree, his expression a mix of pride and trepidation. Jackson raised a hand, silencing the crowd. "I've come here today because the truth can't stay buried any longer." His voice was firm, resonating through the square. He opened the folder, pulling out documents and photographs. This town has a history, one that many would rather forget. But forgetting doesn't erase the damage. These papers prove that Brad Tate's family, led by his grandfather, orchestrated acts of violence against our community, including the murder of my mother. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Jackson's words carried weight, forcing the townspeople to confront a past many had chosen to ignore. We cannot move forward until we acknowledge the harm that's been done. This evidence will be handed over to state authorities, and I trust they will ensure justice is served. He turned to Clara, who stepped forward and began distributing copies of the documents to reporters. Brad, standing at the edge of the crowd, clenched his fists, his face a mask of fury. His gang members exchanged uneasy glances, sensing their leader's growing instability. That evening, Maplewood Park was eerily quiet. Jackson and Elias walked along the familiar paths, the tension between them replaced by a tentative understanding. The documents had been handed over, but both men knew Brad wouldn't let the day's events go unanswered. They reached the central clearing, where Brad waited, flanked by his remaining gang members. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" Brad sneered. "Dragging my family's name through the mud like that?" Jackson stepped forward, his posture calm but unyielding. "Your family's actions speak for themselves. It's time to end this, Brad. You don't have to keep repeating their mistakes." Brad laughed, a bitter sound that echoed through the clearing. "End this? You think a speech and some papers will change anything? You're just like the rest of them, trying to tear us down." "This isn't about tearing anyone down," Elias said, stepping beside his son. "It's about accountability. And it's about breaking the cycle of hate." Brad's face twisted in rage. He drew a knife from his belt and pointed it at Elias. "You've taken everything from me. My family's pride, our legacy. Now I'll take something from you." Jackson moved swiftly, positioning himself between Brad and his father. "You want to fight? Fine. But leave him out of this." The confrontation erupted into chaos. Brad lunged, but Jackson sidestepped, using his training to disarm and subdue him without inflicting serious harm. The gang hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or flee. "It's over, Brad," Jackson said, pinning him to the ground. "You don't have to keep doing this." Brad struggled, his eyes wild with anger and fear. "You think this changes anything? They'll never stop." Elias stepped closer, his voice steady. "You're right, hatred like this doesn't end on its own. But it doesn't have to define you. You have a choice." Brad's defiance faltered, confusion flickering across his face. Jackson released him, standing back as the gang members began to retreat one by one. The weight of Elias's words hung heavy in the air. By morning, the town was alive with the news of the confrontation. Brad and his remaining followers were taken into custody, thanks to Jackson's efforts and the evidence now in the hands of law enforcement. At Clara's cafe, townspeople gathered to discuss the events. Clara stood at the counter, serving coffee with a sense of quiet triumph. Elias sat at a table by the window, his gaze distant but peaceful. Jackson joined him, sliding into the seat across from his father. "You did it," Elias said, his voice tinged with pride. Jackson shook his head. "We did it. All of us." Clara approached, setting down 2 steaming mugs. "Here's to new beginnings," she said, raising her own cup in a toast. That evening, Elias and Jackson stood in the park, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. The weight of the past days had eased, replaced by a fragile hope. "You know, I used to sit here with your mother," Elias said softly. "She'd talk about how this town could be better. How we could be better." Jackson nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "She was right. And we're getting there. One step at a time." Elias placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you, Jackson. More than you know." Jackson smiled, the gesture small but genuine. "Thanks, Dad." As the sun dipped below the horizon, the 2 men stood in companionable silence, the promise of a brighter future stretching out before them. Clara's cafe was more crowded than it had been in years. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and homemade biscuits filled the air as townspeople gathered around the tables. Conversations buzzed with a mix of relief and optimism. Clara stood at the center, commanding the room with her presence. "We've been through a lot," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "But this is just the beginning. If we want real change, we need to work together." A young woman raised her hand. "What can we do?" Clara smiled. "We start by listening. By acknowledging the hurt that's been buried for too long. Then we take steps to make sure everyone feels safe and valued. It's about building trust." Jackson stood at the back, arms crossed, a faint smile on his lips as he watched the exchange. Elias sat beside him, nodding in quiet agreement. The room's energy was contagious, a stark contrast to the fear and tension that had gripped the town just days before. "And we'll need leaders," Clara added, glancing at Jackson. "People who can guide us forward." Jackson shook his head slightly, but Clara only grinned. "We'll talk about it later," she teased, eliciting a ripple of laughter from the crowd. The sun was bright over Maplewood Park as a crowd gathered near the gazebo. A new plaque had been installed, its polished surface reflecting the light. Elias stood at the forefront, Clara by his side. The plaque read, "In honor of those who fought for justice, may their legacy inspire us all." Elias stepped forward, his voice steady but emotional. "This isn't just about the past. It's about the future we want to build. A future where our children don't have to face the same struggles we did. Where this town can truly be a home for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause as Elias stepped back. Jackson caught his father's eye and gave a small nod, pride shining through his usually stoic demeanor. Later that evening, Jackson and Elias worked side by side in Elias's living room. A cracked photo frame lay on the table, its contents a family picture from years ago. Elias carefully cleaned the glass while Jackson fixed the wooden frame. "Your mother loved this picture," Elias said quietly. "She said it reminded her of everything good, even when things were hard." Jackson paused, his hand steadying the frame. "I wish I'd been here more. Maybe things would have been different." Elias looked at his son, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and love. "We can't change the past. But we can decide what we do with the time we have now." Jackson nodded, securing the last nail. "Then let's make it count." They exchanged a quiet smile, the photo now framed and upright once more. The local high school auditorium was filled with students and parents, their faces eager and curious. Jackson stood at the podium, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding but approachable. "When I left this town, I thought I'd never come back," he began. "I thought the past was something I could outrun. But I've learned that healing doesn't come from running. It comes from facing what's broken and working to fix it." The room was silent, every eye on him. "You have the power to break cycles. To stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. And you're not alone. This town has good people, people who care. Together, we can make Maplewood a place we're all proud to call home." The audience erupted into applause as Jackson stepped back, his heart lighter than it had been in years. The evening sun bathed Maplewood Park in golden light. Elias sat on his favorite bench, the one overlooking the pond. He watched as Jackson walked down the path, Clara and a few townspeople joining him. Their laughter carried through the air, a melody of hope and renewal. Elias closed his eyes, the warmth of the sun on his face. For the first time in years, he felt a deep, abiding peace. The fight was far from over, but they were on the right path. Together, they would make it. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the park in a tranquil hush. Elias opened his eyes, a small smile playing on his lips as he watched his son and the others disappear into the distance. They were walking forward, and that was enough.